Okay, now we're going to look at the part 2 of culture. So culture is not static. Forces, which include new technology, discoveries, inventions, immigration, and diffusion, work to produce cultural change and cultural diversity. This week, we're going to look at cultural change, cultural diversity, and culture shock, ethnocentrism, and cultural relativism, along with a few others in terms of the cultural views, the perspectives of culture. So let's begin our look at culture continued. Now, societies continually experience cultural change at both the material and non-material levels. Changes in technology continue to shape the material cultural society. Some definitions of influence on cultural change. I'm going to go through some of these and then we'll carry on. I've mentioned technology as at the heart of some of this. Technology are the changes that make significant differences in people's lives. For example, the printing press in around 1440 made the messages that people might want to communicate to others public. The steam engine, 1698, looked at the potential to create motion and to have machinery do work that men used to be able to do. It had a huge impact on industry. The first computer, 1946. You may not have known that. The internet, 26 years ago. Only 26 years ago. The internet is not that old. That's just to name a few of these technologies which have shaped culture and societies. Now there's 3 other elements that I've touched on just in the introduction that I'll revisit. Discovery. Discovery is something previously unknown and unrecognized. Now this doesn't happen as frequently as the next 2. Discoveries are things that have never been known and then they occur. Some medicines and treatments that help eradicate viruses and bacteria. Some technologies that we have discovered have had an impact profoundly on people's lives, but they don't happen so frequently. Invention, it does happen more frequently. It's reshaping existing cultural items into new forms. The development of new technologies that use the internet. We may have, we had the iPods before the internet. We had cell phones when the internet came around, tablets, computers. These are inventions, new technologies that are based on already existing technology and discoveries. And then the third piece is immigration and diffusion. And this has always been interesting to me because it seems when we see examples of it, we're surprised. So that is the transmission of cultural items and social practices from one culture to another. So if you've ever traveled around the world or you are from other parts of the world, there may be stores, for example, restaurants, products that you've seen in those other countries that are more normally based or are originated based in North America. McDonald's in China, for example, doesn't seem to fit, but that's immigration and diffusion. Diffusion is the way that McDonald's fits into Chinese culture, say, or the way we have Chinese food restaurants, not to say that they are all authentic. However, that diffusion of borrowing from one culture and introducing it into another culture is this diffusion. All parts of culture do not change at the same rate. Cultural lag, now this is William Ogburn's term for a gap between the technological development of society, the material culture, and its moral and legal institutions, the non-material culture. Just use the example of the invention of the car. The cultural lag in the invention of the car was seatbelts, for example. At some point in the development of the technology, somebody didn't think that these cars would go faster and there'd be more cars, and therefore the prospect of accidents, and therefore what's the safest way to manage an accident for the occupants in it, and seatbelts being one of those things. I think they only came law in the 70s or the 60s. So that would be a cultural lag. The material culture of the car and the seatbelt, and the non-material culture would be the laws and the belief, if you will, that that's the right thing to do. Now, cultural diversity, this refers to the whole wide range of cultural differences found between and within nations. And, for example, Canada is renowned for its cultural diversity. We have a law that enshrines multiculturalism. Whereas in the States, they still have cultural diversity, but there's an expectation, and we certainly see more recently, where that is being brought up for further discussion as to how cultural diverse and how do we treat that cultural diversity within a nation. Now, a couple of other terms that get played out a lot in sociology, and one is called heterogeneous societies. Now, Canada is a heterogeneous cultural diversity is inevitable, and Canada, we're renowned for that. So one of the characteristics that is part of Canada is our heterogeneousness, the diversity that is expressed in Canada. Heterogeneous cultures can have many languages, ethnic groups, and religions. In Canada, in the past 150 years, 13 million people have come to Canada from other parts of the world. That's contributing to our heterogeneousness. The alternative, the other side of that, is what's known as homogeneous. There's one language, ethnicity, and religion, and the like. Sweden is a good example of that. Now, we could still argue that most parts of the world today are getting more and more heterogeneous than they are homogeneous, but there are still homogeneous cultures in our world today. And not to say that that's bad, it's just to say that's an alternative. And I should have reframed that better at the beginning. Now, there's two other terms I want to introduce you to. Subcultures. Well, we'll start with subcultures. It's a group of people who share a distinctive set of cultural beliefs and behaviors that differ in some significant way from the larger society. So subcultures are a culture among themselves while living in a larger culture, and their belief system might be different in some significant way and distinctive way from the larger culture. Some examples, and you might be familiar with some of these groups. The subculture group of the Hutterites. They've been largely out west, more Midwest, but the Hutterites are able to keep their own culture while adapting to technology of modern agriculture. Other Canadian examples would be Muslims, Italian Canadians, Orthodox Jews, Generation Xers, bikers. They all can have an element of this sort of subcultureness. Now, the other alternative to subculture is what's known as counterculture. Countercultures are groups that have strongly held beliefs that reject the dominant societal values and norms, and they seek alternative lifestyles. Now, they still occur, that you'll find examples of that today. Some of the more common historic from more my generation, I guess, would be the beatniks of the 50s. They dressed differently. They listened to specifically different music. They had a belief about the culture that was important to them. The hippies of the 60s, they are often misunderstood in terms of what we think they are about. Neo-Nazi skinheads, they occur today as well as in the past, and the Al-Qaeda terrorist groups. These are counterculture groups, and they range from relatively benign, the beatniks of the 50s, the hippies of the 60s, to something a little more ominous out of the neo-Nazi skinheads and Al-Qaeda groups. So let's review some terms that we can fall within some of this cultural shift that occurs. Culture shock. The disorientation that people feel when they encounter culture radically different from their own. When they, you might have traveled yourself either to Canada or to other cultures, and going to these places may have ran into things that you went, whoa, wow. When people travel to other societies, they may not know how to respond in that particular setting. And it's that difference of cultural expectations that bang in front of your face that sometimes makes us go, wow, I didn't realize. It's why when traveling, it's a good idea to visit sites of those countries to find out what are some of the things you need to be aware of. So, culture shock. Ethnocentrism. This is the tendency to regard one's own culture and your own group as the standard, and thus superior, whereas all the other groups are basically considered inferior. Now, this is based on the assumption that one's own way of life is superior to all others. And we often will express this. Sometimes the more positive way to express it would be your school's having an event, you're playing a game against another school, or your hockey team is playing against another hockey team. So you sing the school song and you pledge allegiance to your team jersey. That might be considered a positive ethnocentric thing to do. But the negative would be looking at other cultures in the world and judging them as less than yours because you value yours and think yours is the standard. And you forget that that other culture looks at your culture and maybe thinks the same thing. So who's right? So ethnocentrism is that tendency to regard our own as superior and everybody else's as inferior. Cultural relativity. Here, behaviors and customs of any culture must be viewed and analyzed by the culture's own standard. Helps us to get beyond the ethnocentric view of cultures. And that's a hard thing to do, but it is partly where you use your sociological imagination, is to get out of your own skin for a moment and view that culture from their own geographic location, their own cultural history, from their own people, from their own institutions, that those become important to them. And that's cultural relativity, as I don't judge that culture based on my standards of the culture that I'm from. And that's not easy to do. Now, although all sociologists share a similar purpose, they typically see culture through somewhat different lenses because they're guided by different theoretical perspectives in their research. So we're going to look at the few that we will revisit throughout the semester. Functionalists. Now, functionalist view of culture assumes a common language and shared values help produce consensus and harmony. So what's important from the functionalist perspective is that values and norms. Values would be the underlying belief that we hold as dear to us, and the norms would be those informal and formal ways of expressing those values, are the glue. And that's important from this group. It's the glue that holds the society together. Functionalists really just view that society is relatively stable because values and norms are static for the most part. They change, but not rapidly, and that's what holds everybody together. Now, Malinowski, he viewed that cultures function to meet our needs, people's needs, and they do so in very specific ways. One is through biological or physical needs, food and procreation. That's one of the purposes, one of the values and the norms. We form families, we have children, and we look after our physical needs through employment, buying a house or renting an apartment, looking after our children. Then the second is instrumental needs, that there are laws, there's education, there are instruments by which we can meet those physical needs and procreation needs and hold our society together. The third is integrative needs. Religion and art, for example, are the things that sort of give us other purposes and other ways of strengthening our cultural beliefs. Popular culture, may help to integrate people. Regardless of race, class, sex, age, or other characteristics, many people are brought together, at least in spirit, to cheer teams, compete in other major sporting events such as the Grey Cup and the Olympic Games. Television and the internet help integrate recent immigrants into the mainstream culture, whereas longer-term residents may become more homogenized as a result of seeing the same images being exposed in the same beliefs and values. And that's part of the functional perspective around continuity and values and norms holding the society together. Yet there may be, and there are, dysfunctions that are present. Dysfunctions are the discord, the violence in media, and the like may promote antisocial behavior, and that would be dysfunctional. But functionalists are willing to accept some dysfunction in the overall system as long as there's generally stability. So that's functionalism. Conflict theory, that's a different perspective. Remember, a different set of sunglasses. Culture may be used by certain groups to maintain their privilege and exclude others from society's benefits. Now remember, one of the main premises is the inequity within society. There are the haves versus the have-not, the bourgeois versus the proletariat. And so, from cultural perspective, this group here tries to influence the overall societal experience to hold on to what they've got, and if it keeps people here, so be it, but as long as we hold what we have. As early conflict theorist Karl Marx stressed, ideas are cultural creations of a society by the most powerful members. Thus, it is possible for political, economic, and social leaders to use ideology, an integrated system of ideas that is external to and coercive of people, to maintain their positions of dominance in society. And that's a huge part of the conflict perspective, is that they work to keep this. The laws are in place to protect their positions. That has a big part of keeping that inequity in existence. Many contemporary conflict theorists agree with Marx's assertion that ideas and non-material components of culture are used by agents of the ruling class to affect the thoughts and actions of members of the lower class. Remember, non-material component of culture are the beliefs, the laws, the institutions and how they operate, government, are all part of those non-material components and how they can affect. So we have an election coming up, and we are going to be asked to vote for the party that best represents the needs of the most. And you have different groups, conservatives, liberals, NDP, and the Green as being the four primary ones. Each has its own ideology, its belief about how they can best represent the society. Some are more interested in preserving status quo and the way things are, and others are trying to be more conscious of social issues. But they're different, and it's our responsibility to go vote and to vote. So I hope you will vote in this coming election. Moving along to mass media conglomerates such as, this is under conflict still, mass media conglomerates such as AOL, Time Warner, Disney, and Viacom. You may not even be familiar with all of those, but they are huge corporations with more than just what it sounds like. For example, General Electric isn't just doing light bulbs, they're doing insurance, airplane engines. They're doing they're one of the 25 largest corporations in the world. So mass media conglomerates create popular culture such as the films, the shows, and the amusement parks that support this belief system of what we should be doing. The top 10 corporations like P&G, Procter & Gamble, Kraft, and Unilever can and do influence our shopping about what is desirable, fashionable. If you're curious, check out Unilever's website, UNILEVER.com, and see the products that they are responsible for. The two that jump out to me in terms of how these corporations will influence us and to what we think we want is the product Dove. The beauty campaigns promote women as strong individuals, but not based on their beauty alone. And Axe, which for the longest time did commercials where just about women were at the men's feet because they wore a certain cologne. Very opposing views, but owned by the same company. The company doesn't care that it's got a dichotomous introduction. They only care that they're influencing you to buy products that they sell. So it's an important element. They function to promote the increased consumption of commodities, people come to believe that they need these. Be a critical thinker. Buy what you need, not what they tell you you want or need. The third group, symbolic interactionalists, they suggest people create, maintain, and modify culture as they go about their everyday activities. From this perspective, symbols make communication with others possible because they provide people with shared meanings. And people create, maintain, and modify culture as they go about their everyday activities. Because we have language, which is made of symbols, which help us communicate, we can shape people's beliefs through social media, traditional media, the way we interact with people on a day-to-day basis, sitting on the bus, downtown, over lunch, all impact how we feel. It's where we find allegiance with people who think similarly and where we recognize differences. People negotiate their social reality. Values and norms are not independent realities that automatically determine their behavior. Rather, we tend to reinterpret them in each situation we encounter. This approach highlights how people maintain and change culture through their interactions with others. Just being in post-secondary is probably already starting to shape and change some of what you thought you knew. You're getting new information, you've met with new people, you've talked on topics you maybe haven't talked about before, all of which is shaping how you view the world around you. If I were to, as an example, if I were to reach out my hand and you stomped on my foot, I would probably reevaluate that gesture. Its meaning and my future action will be dependent on my reevaluating this particular gesture. That's symbolic interactionalism. And then the last group we're going to look at are the postmodern thinkers. Now they believe that that there are many cultures in Canada. So they don't believe in studying culture, they believe in studying cultures. Just in Canada alone, and they believe that we need a new way of conceptualizing culture in society. Some of the key theory that there's a Eurocentric lens that conditions our view of all cultures, and that culture of our age produces a social world that is not real, but it's simulated. And what they mean by that is much of what occurs in a postmodern world, which is what we're in terms of all the information technology and the access to content that we can get on the internet, creates a hyper-real, overly real, if you will, world that we can see online, that when we look at the world we live in, it doesn't seem to measure up to the excitement and creativity and the innovation that can occur online. So it becomes our simulated view. So we don't need to speak about culture. We need to speak more about cultures with the S, not culture. Now, Baudrillard's insights into this, he has significant exposure, or suggests there's significant exposure to media processes, which uses, in us, which sort of senses a social reality. And he says that media creates in us a hyper-reality. We begin to live in a situation where the simulation of reality is much more real to us than the phenomena itself. Some of the examples that he pulls to sort of say this is the case is Disney theme parks. We can become a survivor over major obstacles, and we have the appearance of power, but we really don't have any, and we live for just those few moments without fear of crime or violence. So the postmodern sort of looks at the role of some of these innovations that have occurred, that we draw ourselves on these social media platforms and we lose sight of what is real and what we can and cannot expect out of life. So the future, what do we know, or what do we think? Well, as we look forward to the future, both diversity and technology are going to continue to shape culture and global cultural patterns, reinforcing the value of keeping our sociological imaginations actively engaged. When I say our, I mean yours and mine. We need to be able to step back from some things and evaluate. So some other predictions. Well, cultural diversity is going to continue to grow. That's not going to disappear. Technology, especially things in television, radio, videos, electronic communication, computers, and cyberspace, will have continued and profound effects on culture. The role of AI. Third, do we have cultural freedom, or is it more symbolic, that we really don't? We just appear like we do. Most of the world's people, however, will not be able to participate in this technology. They will be concerned for their basic subsistence. So it's hard to know where culture will go, but what we can probably say with certainty is that it's going to continue to be fluid. It won't remain the same. It will continue to change, and we will be part of that change as we go forward. Well, there we go. Next week, we're going to look at socialization. How are we socialized? What are we socialized to do? And can we influence our socialization? We'll see you next week.